Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights. And each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by an anonymous donor who proudly and generously supports freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Our first historical highlight of the week is Lord Shaftesbury. At Piccadilly Circus, the busiest intersection in London, England, there sits the Shaftesbury Memorial Fountain, which some call Eros. Placed there to commemorate Lord Shaftesbury, born April 28, 1801, the fountain symbolizes his belief that his Christian duty was to support the less fortunate. He is quoted as saying, "I think a man's religion, if it is worth anything, should enter into every sphere of life and rule his conduct in every relation." As a member of Parliament, Shaftesbury spent his personal time and resources championing causes like the reform of child labor laws, the elimination of teenage prostitution, the end of the opium trade, and improved sewer systems. Our next historical highlight is Athanasius, the former bishop of Alexandria, Egypt. Athanasius was the first person to use the term canon when referring to Scripture and its authority, and he opposed a major heresy known as Arianism. Named for Alexandrian churchman Arius, Arianism stated that Jesus was not in full agreement with God the Father, so the concept of the Trinity could not be correct. This led to the formation of the Council of Nicaea. Athanasius would be exiled several times and ultimately flee for his life. However, his faith and his positions about the total authority of Scripture never wavered. He died on May 2nd, 373 AD. Our final historical highlight of the week is Thomas Coke, the first bishop of the Methodist Church. Coke was an attorney and the mayor of Brecon, Wales, and he was thought to be John Wesley's successor. After coming to America following the American Revolution, Coke and Francis Asbury were the first superintendents, or bishops, of the Methodist Church in America. As he journeyed to India for full-time missions work, Coke died at sea on May 4th, 1814. Though some accounts give different dates, May 4th seems to be the most accurate guess. The legacies of Coke and Asbury live on in the Cokesbury bookstore, named by merging the two men's last names. Today's deep dive is a special segment from the Christian History Chronicles. In addition to producing This Week in Christian History, the Center for Christian History produces a free, live, informational Zoom session each month called the Christian History Chronicles. When you visit centerforchristianhistory.com, you can subscribe to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Instagram in order to see the upcoming schedules for the Chronicles. In this special segment, Nick Walters, director of the Center for Christian History, talks with Ron Rychlak of the University of Mississippi School of Law about Pope Pius XII.
So tell us about what Pius XII did do or did not do. If I understood right, I mean, did he start out as an archbishop maybe in Munich? Is that right? During the time as the Nazis were growing in power, or
he was not an archbishop.
okay.
He was in essence an ambassador. The Vatican has nuncios, not ambassadors. It's actually because the Vatican. It's a long story here, but the Vatican nuncios existed before ambassadors did. The Vatican has a long history of international relations. So, but and think of it as an ambassador. He was originally accredited to part of Germany, later expanded to cover all of Germany. But he was in Germany in the 1920s when the German soldiers came back from World War I, feeling they had been betrayed by the government, and that leads to the grumpy feel, the bad feelings from the Nazis and Hitler, and they're actually in Munich at the same time. I mean, Pacelli is watching this stuff evolve. He wrote back to the Vatican twice, I think, and I might miss the years exact, so I don't want to say, but I think 23, I think, was the year he talked about Catholic bishops, he named some who were setting a good example by standing up for the Jews and for the Catholics who were being persecuted by this group that came to be known as the National Socialists or the Nazis. They were not known by that term at the time. And in fact, there's a sort of famous, I cite it often. I think we actually may have some more by now, but of the first 44 speeches that we had records of Pacelli giving in Germany during this time, in 40 of those 44, he condemned racism, nationalism, the things that in fact were fundamental to Nazism as it was emerging. I mean, he very much stood against that. He also had to contend in 1919 with a brief communist revolt that took over, that actually his nunciature, which would be like the embassy, was sprayed with machine gun fire. So very disruptive, very time, but Pacelli came to understand Germany in a way that, you know, a lot of other folks would not in that era have known. So he knew and he saw and he understood what a threat Adolf Hitler truly was.
Yeah. So how does he take that then with that knowledge of being on the ground, eyeball witness, seeing it, understanding it, speaking out against it? Then how does that kind of emerge and roll into the time that he actually is Pope? When does he become Pope?
Well, okay, so 1929, he's called home from to Rome from Germany, and was never back in Germany again after 29. But he became Cardinal Secretary of State. So he's in charge of international relations. One of the big issues there is he, on behalf of the Vatican, signed an agreement with Germany. A lot of people say, you know, he made a deal with Hitler. It was an international agreement that had been offered to Germany in the 1920s. He formally signed it, and it actually ended up being a good thing for Catholics and really for Jews in the long run, because they were able to protect, the church was able to protect Jewish people, at least in some cases, because of this this agreement. But that's a controversial point in and of itself. In 1937, Pacelli actually wrote an encyclical, the most formal form of papal statements. He wrote it for Pius XI, his predecessor. Pius XI said, and a lot of times people juxtapose the two. They'll say Pius XI was a good guy, Pius XII was a bad guy. Pius XI stood against the Nazis, Pius XII was quiet and did not stand against the Nazis. Well, Pius XII, Pacelli, and another German bishop worked together to write this 1937 encyclical, which was written in German. The only time an encyclical has been written in German and released in German rather than Latin. It was not released in Rome. It was distributed across Germany and read on Palm Sunday in the masses, and then immediately confiscated by the Nazis. Printing presses were destroyed. People who distributed it were arrested. It was completely suppressed after that, but it was very clearly a condemnation of the rising nationalism, the Hitlerism that was spreading, had come across Germany by that time. So that was a more confrontational approach than what happened during the war. What happens now, 1938, Pius XI passes away, Pius XII gets elected, but war also breaks out right in this time frame. And so Pius XII's first encyclical, in essence, lays out what's the role of a pope in a time of war. And everybody skips over that. I devote an entire chapter to it in Hitler, the War, and the Pope. He believed that, you know, that the church has obligations to people on all sides of conflicts. The church doesn't take sides formally. The church engages in charitable work, in hospital type work, in saving type work. I think he laid out exactly what he thought was appropriate for the church. And you can argue, maybe, you know, you say maybe the church should do something different, but he laid out in advance, here's what I think a church should do. And that's what he did throughout the war. He did not repeatedly go to the bully pulpit and condemn Nazism. That's what raises the issue. A lot of people think he should have. Some people think it could have been better. He has reasons to think that it would not have helped, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. But he did what he could for rescue type work, trying to minister to Germans who are brought up trapped in this. Even there were a lot of AWOL German soldiers. It was one of the big dramas, one of the big issues. If you're in an occupied area and a German soldier knocks on your door and maybe a church door and saying, "I'm seeking refuge. I've gone AWOL. I don't want to be part of the Nazis anymore," do you let him in? But there were, in fact, even in Rome, there were AWOL German soldiers. There were behind enemy lines trapped Allied soldiers. There were Jews. There were gypsies. There were homosexuals. There were all of these different groups that are seeking refuge and hiding out. And the church is with different ministries in different ways in different buildings, sheltering and helping and doing what it can to help everyone who's being persecuted by the Nazis. If Pius XII had spoken out, could the church have continued to do that? I think Pius XII thought not, and there's a few different pieces of evidence. One is when Poland was occupied, Pius wrote a strong condemnation of the Nazis that was smuggled into the bishop, Prince Sophia, who was still in Poland at the time, and presumably to be read publicly. A letter came back to Rome from Sophia that said, "Holy Father, thank you so much for your leadership. The people of Poland will never forget what you've done, what your prayers mean, what your work means. However, if I read this statement, people will die. So I'm not going to read this statement." Similar thing happened in Holland. When the Nazis came into Holland, the Catholic and Protestant leaders got together and said, "We're going to issue a statement that says, we know what you Nazis do. We're not going to put up with it." The Nazis said, "If you do that, you'll regret it because we'll make things worse than ever." The Catholics went ahead and made a statement. Catholic bishops did. The Protestants did not. The Nazis then said, "Okay, up until now, if you had if you converted, if you had a baptismal certificate, we would recognize a person as being a Christian and not deport them. Henceforth, we will not recognize Catholic baptismal certificates. So a Jewish person with a Catholic baptismal certificate is our worst enemy, and we'll send them off as soon as possible." Edith Stein, who later became Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, is one of those people who was shipped off and killed
Really?
in this process because of that. Now that comes back to the Pope, and but this is one thing that was interesting when I read those testimonies. This was interesting because I'd heard this story. The story is reported in a couple of different books that says Pius XII was preparing to make a strong statement against the Nazis when word of Edith Stein and what happened in Holland came back, and he went over and he burned the letter he had begun to draft that was a condemnation of the Nazis. And I'd read that, and I thought, yeah, that sounds a little far-fetched to me, to be honest. But when I read those testimonies, when they invited me over to the Vatican, and I went through there were 3 witnesses who testified under oath that they saw that happen. They were in the room, and it did happen. So, whether I have no reason to question them. I guess it did happen. But I mean, you see now where Pius is. If you speak out, people die. If bishops speak out, if I don't speak out, I can save a lot of people, and we are saving a lot of people. And there's a whole lot of rescue work going on. If I speak out, we will lose that. That'll be gone. And will there be any benefit to it? And I go through one chapter in my book talking about what if he made a statement See, I mean, there's no free speech in any Nazi area, any Nazi occupied area. I mean, the impact lasts for about a minute, and the retaliation wipes everything out forever. So, for historical purposes, we could say, gee, what a great leader he was if he had made that statement, even though it causes more people to die, rescue efforts disappear. Um, that's the problem.
Mm. Well, and that's and is that what most of the other books are focusing on, or that is a component at least of the other books that, hey, you should have stood up for what was right. You should have stood out there and made an international stink about it. And your
Yeah.
silence is basically um, a support, for lack of a better way of saying it, et cetera, et cetera. And instead of really being able to understand, well, what was going on? What did the witnesses who were there have to say about all that, which is part of what you were able to see when you were able to go into that archive.
And that's exactly right. And so it's always a little bit funny to me. Um, I, in a different book, wrote a chapter about this, about how the goalpost is always shifting. I mean, one critic will say Pius was afraid of Hitler. Another one says he likes Hitler. He was an anti-Semite. He wasn't an anti-Semite, but he only was concerned about money. And he wasn't concerned about money, but he wanted centralization of power of the church. There's always a why. There's always a he didn't speak out as much as he should have, and here's why. And the whys are wildly inconsistent, and I think they're always wrong. I mean, I think that there's two things at play here. I mean, I think he knew what was happening, and really no one questioned that he knew that at the time either. I mean, the New York Times Christmas Day editorials, 1941 and 1942, said Pius XII is the only one who's standing up for the Jews. He's pointing his finger right at Hitler. That New York Times lead editorial is saying the Pope is standing against him. The diplomatic folks understood that the Pope was with him. After the war, letters between the president, Truman, because FDR passed away, Truman and the Pope talk about, thanking the Pope, and actually some correspondence during the war from FDR about how the Pope is working with the Allies. And letters, I did go through some archives in Dunwoody Seminary in New York, where there's communication from Rome to Cardinal Spellman, who's the effective leader of the Catholic Church in the United States, talking about collaboration between them. And the Catholic bishops, which they were not under the oppression of the Nazis, were not occupied. So their statements could go out, could have an impact, could be read. They were very outspoken about Hitler and the Nazis and the treatment of the Jews. And afterwards, Spellman and the Pope thanked one another for their collaboration in this project. This was not the American bishops acting on their own. This was in collaboration. So the Pope was trying to figure out what buttons to push to make things work best.
But some of that really had to be, wouldn't you guess, because of his background and being in this nuncio position, that really kind of understood this whole idea of, international politics and how it works and kind of how things fit, and how do I bring my faith piece into a component of all of that to make sure that all of that is, as compared to maybe somebody that was maybe only a theologian. I say only, I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but I mean just maybe that was what their background was, and they could do theology, and talk about St. Augustine till they were blue in the face, but did they really understand the nuances sometimes that go on in the greater part of international politics because of that role? Surely that had to play into his thought process.
No, absolutely. I mean, he's aware that every statement he makes has ramifications, not only for him, not only even for Rome, but really across the war area, the Nazi area, for really the whole world. Let's face it. And so, being aware of Hitler, having seen the rise of the Nazis, he wasn't fooled about what they were. He was taking a realistic approach to what he could accomplish and what he could not accomplish.
Well, he didn't have to read somebody's report
Right.
Other than his own, right? Other than his own notes, to be able to tell you what he really, really knew about all that to do too. So,
1935, he called Nazis uh, uh, false plagiarists with the pride of Lucifer. So again, he's Secretary of State, but he's not. He was more outspoken, but it was not a time of war. I mean, once you're in a time of war, things are different than when you're in a time of peace.
You can watch Serestaknik's interview with Ron Rychlak on the Center for Christian History website at centerforchristianhistory.com. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by an anonymous donor who proudly and generously supports freedom of speech and freedom of religion. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi College, in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube Music, or wherever fine podcasts are found. Our next episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.